obviously we talked about at the beginning of the show, a lot of recent regulatory topics there. We're seeing a lot of move with the SEC here. What is your general viewpoint from the SEC, Binance, and Coinbase, and what's going on between those two entities and then the SEC itself?
So the Binance case and the Coinbase case are two very different kinds of cases. So let's just be clear about that. That one is much more salacious than the other, one being the Binance case, and that's laid out fairly well in the SEC complaint. The Coinbase case is meant to be, I think, a walkthrough of crypto assets. Now, what we see in the latest development from Financial Times is, and I'm just really going to quote Brian Armstrong here, is that they had said delist everything, but they weren't willing to prove that everything else was actually a security. So as a business model, what should Coinbase have done there? It doesn't offer to the general public either. So that's another challenge, is that if the SEC is asking Coinbase to delist everything but Bitcoin, but not giving the general public even notice of what it is that is so concerning about any particular asset, that's a very tough stance to maintain. It's a very tough narrative posture for the SEC. So not sure what the end game is going to be here for the SEC. I'm as curious as you are to see what happens next.
I've got a question for you. I got to take it, Zach. I got to take it. So since you do focus on helping Web3 and crypto companies shape strategies around the current regulatory landscapes, it's got to be very, very complex. How do you think that this is going to translate over into NFTs or digital collectibles? Because let's face it, those, depending on how those are built, depending what type of smart contracts, utility, anything that they're doing, they're very, I guess, ambiguous right now.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that one of the challenges in terms of a narrative for the general population when it comes to NFTs is still an almost misunderstanding of what it is and the utility that it provides. And so I think anything that Web3 companies can do in articulating the diversity of the technology, what are the diversity of the use cases, the diversity of the utility, the diversity of the population using it, that's really going to help put some meat, some flesh on the bones for the general public to understand it more past the crypto token here, crypto token there. What do those mean?
Hermine, what's your view? I mean, I know that, like, obviously the jury is still out on this, right? But what's your view on whether or not the recent sort of SEC crackdown is a direct response to the FTX implosion, or if some of this stuff was in the works significantly before last November? I'm just kind of curious as to whether or not you see it as, again, a response or something that Gary Gensler's SEC has been building up for some time.
I'm going to give you the typical lawyer response, which is it's a little of both, right? Like, it's a little of both, and you can see it actually in the way that the complaint was filed. If you look at the Coinbase complaint, it seems a little rushed in terms of the analysis of every particular coin. However, SEC did file the Ripple case back in December of 2020 under Clayton, right? So this has been brewing in the SEC staff's mind for a long time. The timing was probably a little more rushed than maybe staff would be comfortable with, but it doesn't mean that this wasn't in some fashion. We're not exactly sure what fashion this might have developed independent of the FTX collapse.
Okay, cool. So I want to get to this idea of enforcement fatigue. I mean, you also must be in a really interesting position with a lot of these clients, right? Because there's just a lot of competing, contradictory, schizophrenic even information out there in the marketplace that must be really hard for someone like you to advise on. So I just wanted to get a sense for, like, what is the current state of play with people that you are talking to? Are they pressing ahead? Are they saying, we are so back, we are making this happen? Or is there still trepidation, caution, a freeze on the plans that may run afoul of current regulations?
So I think that one of the helpful things about crypto winter is that it did narrow the field and narrow the ambitions of a lot of these startups, right? So they had to really crystallize what it was that they were seeking to launch in this period. By doing that, I think it afforded them some discipline in thinking, okay, these enforcement proceedings that are happening right now, how much does this affect the more narrow scope of business I had? And I think that right now, the most impactful thing that these companies can do is to, again, and I said this earlier, create a bespoke narrative. What is it that sets them apart, different? And that allows for a much more diverse view of the industry to come to the forefront to the general population.
All right, we gotta talk about FTX now. There's a new development with FTX every single day. One of the latest is these diary entries that Sam Bankman-Fried allegedly leaked to the New York Times. Now we have the prosecution saying he should just be in jail until October. What's the likelihood that he is going to be sitting in a prison awaiting trial?
Man, this story is like a never-ending pile of poop, right? Like we just can't. You think that you've like tied it up, and then it just keeps on exploding. So in this situation, you've seen some of the transcripts from the court themselves, and the court is already months ago was already reluctant to grant and continue SBF's bail because they're concerned that the government was being a little too narrow with some of the restrictions. And in the latest order from the judge, you even saw the judge kind of strike out some of the language where it indicated that the government had drafted, right? That it indicated like these kinds of ex parte conversations that could happen, which might impact the trial. And the judge was like, no, which might impact the trial, forget about it. Everything he says is a problem. He's not allowed to talk. This gag order is going to be all encompassing. So this judge has had enough of SBF. A reminder is that this bail that he has at $250 million, that is a huge amount of money. It's 25 times more than what Bernie Madoff had as bail at $10 million. The government has said how it's probably record breaking. So I don't think that there's going to be any patience on the court side. It's worth remembering, though, I think, about why their bail was even granted in the first place and why the government allowed for it in the first place, right? Back when SBF was being extradited, the extradition proceedings happened very quickly. And part of that was probably because the negotiations were like, look, the government will not oppose a bail request. So if you act like a responsible individual and don't muck things up for the judicial system, we'll let you have bail, $250 million, but you can get out.
Tough nuts there. Okay, one last question for you. We've been seeing a few notes about the FTX bankruptcy group going forward and trying to claw back funds. What is the possibility of going back and clawing funds from sports teams, from possible donors, from different foundations?
Well, we've already seen that John Jay had already requested that the campaign donors have a way of giving back funds, which I think narratively made a lot of sense. What are the chances that they'll get these funds back? It's really unclear. I think that what we do see, though, is how far-reaching the FTX bankruptcy proceedings are right now. And what I mean is that they just had their second report come out. They are now going against personally the entire executive team at FTX, including Carolyn Ellison, who's now in the news again for the diary leaks. So I think that we're not sure exactly how far it'll go, but I think that they're trying their hardest to pursue every single avenue. And there is not any door that they will not knock down for the creditors.
Hermine, I got to ask you, as an informed observer, and this has been a saga that has been, stretching out for what seems like ever now. What is your favorite detail in this whole thing that still you can just not believe how rich it is? Well, if you had to point to one, what would it be?
There's so many.
All right. So yes, there are a lot. I think that this pulled on a lot of threads. It was actually the order of restrictions on SBF's parents' phones. You guys may remember that this came out sometime in the spring, but SBF had already done the whole VPN trying to circumvent communications and talking to some former FTX US officials. And so they restricted him because they just don't even trust his parents' guardian of their own phones. And so his parents now have restrictions, and these are Stanford law professor. Stanford's a top 3 law school. I think that that's one of those bonkers things that's got to also just be so painful as a parent to have to live through.
A worthy candidate so much. We'll leave it there. Hermine, thank you for joining us to talk policy and FTX.